In this episode, we're going to focus on a topic that sounds administrative, but is actually one of the strongest predictors of whether an organization will manage AI risk well or stumble into preventable harm: clear ownership. Beginners often imagine risk as something you measure and then fix, but in real organizations, the hardest part is often deciding who is responsible for what, who gets to approve what, and who is answerable when something goes wrong. AI makes this harder because it crosses boundaries. Business teams want value. Technical teams build or configure systems. Legal teams worry about compliance. Security teams worry about threats. And operations teams worry about day-to-day reliability. When ownership is unclear, important tasks fall into the gaps, and those gaps become risk. When ownership is too centralized, decisions slow down and teams route everything upward, which creates shadow use and workarounds. The goal is a balanced approach where responsibilities are clear, decisions are made at the right level, and accountability is visible. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between roles, accountability, and decision rights, and you should be able to describe a simple ownership model for AI risk that makes sense to a beginner. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start by separating 3 ideas that people often mix together: doing work, owning outcomes, and having the authority to decide. A role is the job someone performs, like building a system, reviewing a contract, monitoring performance, or writing policy. Accountability is being answerable for outcomes, meaning if harm occurs, this person or function must explain what happened and what was done to prevent it. Decision rights are the permissions and authority to approve, reject, or require changes, such as approving an AI use case, setting risk boundaries, or deciding whether a system can be deployed. In many organizations, the people who do the work are not the same as the people who own outcomes, and that is normal. What causes trouble is when the organization does not define these relationships explicitly and expects them to sort themselves out during a crisis. In AI risk, you want the relationships defined before anything goes wrong, because that is when decisions are calm and deliberate. The exam mindset expects you to value clarity, defensibility, and governance discipline, and clear ownership is one of the most direct ways to achieve that. A helpful beginner rule is that the owner of the business outcome should not be able to pretend they do not own the risk of that outcome. If a business unit wants to use AI to make or influence decisions, the business cannot treat the AI as a purely technical project that belongs entirely to the technology team. The business is the one seeking the value, so the business must also accept responsibility for ensuring the use is appropriate, controlled, and monitored. This does not mean the business must understand every technical detail. It means the business must be accountable for making sure the right experts are involved and the right controls exist. If the AI system denies customers a benefit, ranks employees, or influences safety-related actions, the business leader responsible for that process should be accountable for how it is governed. This idea prevents a common failure pattern where business teams push for speed, something goes wrong, and then blame is shifted onto technical staff who were never empowered to set boundaries. Accountability should follow the decision to rely on AI for an outcome. Technical teams play a different but equally important role, and beginners should understand what good technical ownership looks like without assuming it equals full accountability. Technical teams are often responsible for building, configuring, integrating, and maintaining AI systems, and they are responsible for explaining technical limitations and operational risks. They may also be responsible for model evaluation, monitoring, and incident response from a technical standpoint, depending on the organization. What they should not be forced into is being the sole decision-maker about whether a use case is acceptable, because acceptability depends on business impact, legal constraints, and organizational appetite for risk. In healthy ownership models, technical teams provide evidence, options, and risk insights, and they have decision rights about technical readiness, like whether performance is sufficient or whether monitoring is in place. They may have the authority to block deployment if minimum technical controls are not met, because that is part of protecting the organization. But accountability for business outcomes still sits with the owners of the process the AI is supporting. Risk, compliance, legal, and privacy functions can feel confusing to beginners because they overlap, so we need a clear way to think about them. These functions typically do not own the business outcome either, but they play a critical governance role by setting standards, reviewing risk, and ensuring the organization can defend its choices. Risk management functions often help define risk frameworks, assessment methods, and reporting expectations, and they may own the process of running consistent risk assessments. Compliance functions focus on meeting external and internal requirements and ensuring the organization can demonstrate adherence. Legal functions interpret laws, contracts, and liability, and they help ensure that the organization's obligations are understood and met. Privacy functions focus on how personal data is collected, used, shared, retained, and protected, which is extremely relevant when AI systems consume large amounts of data or when data flows to vendors. In a good ownership model, these functions have clear decision rights about whether requirements are met, and they have the authority to escalate when risk exceeds acceptable bounds. They should not be treated as last-minute box checkers, because that creates rushed, weak decisions. Security functions are also part of AI risk ownership, but their contribution is often misunderstood. Security teams typically focus on confidentiality, integrity, availability, and threat-driven risk, including how systems might be attacked, manipulated, or abused. In AI systems, security includes protecting data, protecting the system from unauthorized access, and defending against misuse that has a malicious angle. It can also include concerns like whether an AI system could be tricked into revealing sensitive information or whether inputs could be manipulated to force harmful outputs. However, security is not the entire AI risk picture, and security teams should not be expected to own all AI risk just because it is a technology topic. Their ownership is strongest where threats and system protection are involved, and their decision rights may include enforcing security controls and blocking deployment if security requirements are not met. The broader accountability for AI outcomes remains shared with business ownership and governance structures. Clear ownership prevents the common mistake of assigning all AI risk to security and then being surprised when non-security harms occur. Now let's introduce a concept that makes ownership practical: decision points. Ownership becomes real when you can name the decisions that must be made and assign who gets to make them. For AI use, decision points often include approving a new use case, deciding what data can be used, choosing whether a system is high impact, setting required oversight and documentation, approving deployment, and deciding what triggers escalation. There are also decisions about changes, like updating a model, changing data sources, or expanding the system to new users or new regions. If these decisions are not assigned, they will still happen, but they will happen informally, through convenience, and often without documentation. Informal decisions are risky because they are hard to defend later, and they often bypass people who would have raised important concerns. A well-run program names the decisions, assigns them, and records them, because recorded decisions create accountability and learning. Beginners should see that governance is not bureaucracy. It is the practice of making important decisions visible and consistent. Decision rights should also be aligned to impact, because not every AI use needs the same level of approval. If an AI feature is used for low-impact drafting assistance with no sensitive data, the decision process can be simpler and faster. If an AI system influences hiring, lending, healthcare, safety, or legal decisions, then decision rights should involve more review and more senior accountability. This is a principle you will see again and again in risk management. Higher impact requires stronger oversight. The danger is when organizations apply the same lightweight approval to high-impact use cases, because that creates a mismatch between risk and governance. The opposite danger is when organizations apply heavy approvals to everything, which encourages teams to avoid the process and creates shadow AI use. A good ownership model scales with impact, so it is both effective and usable. For the exam mindset, the best answers often reflect proportionality and defensibility rather than extremes. Accountability can sound abstract until you connect it to what happens when something goes wrong. So let's make that concrete. If an AI system produces unfair outcomes, who is responsible for stopping it, explaining it, and correcting it. If an AI tool causes a privacy incident, who is responsible for notifying the right parties and changing processes? If an AI system degrades over time and drift causes harm, who is responsible for monitoring and intervention? If employees misuse AI tools and sensitive data leaks, who is responsible for policy enforcement and training changes? These questions are uncomfortable, but they reveal whether ownership is real. In many organizations, accountability becomes a game of finger-pointing when it is not defined ahead of time. A strong model creates a clear path. The business owner is accountable for the use case. Technical owners are accountable for technical performance and controls. Governance functions are accountable for standards and oversight processes, and escalation routes are defined so leadership is informed when risk is high. Clarity turns chaos into coordinated response. A beginner-friendly way to understand ownership is to imagine an AI system as a shared responsibility chain rather than a single owner. The business sets the goal and accepts accountability for outcomes, which includes deciding whether the benefit is worth the risk. Technical teams design and operate the system, which includes being honest about limitations and ensuring monitoring and controls exist. Risk, compliance, and legal functions define guardrails, review evidence, and ensure the organization can defend its decisions. Security and privacy functions protect data and systems and ensure that sensitive information is handled appropriately. Leadership provides the final decision rights for high-impact or high-risk use cases and sets risk appetite, which is the organization's overall stance on what it is willing to accept. This chain works only when it is explicit, because implicit shared responsibility often becomes no responsibility. For beginners, the key insight is that shared responsibility must still be clearly assigned at each step, or it becomes a gap. Misconceptions about ownership are common, and recognizing them helps you avoid wrong answers on the exam. One misconception is that the vendor owns the risk because the vendor provided the AI tool. Vendors have responsibilities, but the organization using the tool is still accountable for how it is used and what decisions it influences. Another misconception is that the data science team owns everything because they built the model. They may own technical quality, but they do not own business decisions about acceptable impact. Another misconception is that governance means a committee makes all decisions, which can be slow and ineffective. Committees can support oversight, but clear decision rights usually require named owners who can act quickly, with escalation only when needed. Another misconception is that ownership is only needed after an incident, when in reality ownership is what prevents many incidents by ensuring review and controls exist before deployment. These misconceptions matter because the exam often presents plausible but flawed ownership choices that shift responsibility away from where it belongs. We should also talk about how ownership interacts with documentation, because documentation is what makes ownership visible. If you cannot show who approved a use case, what risks were identified, and what controls were required, ownership becomes hard to prove and easy to deny. Documentation also supports continuity when people change roles or leave the organization. It allows new owners to see why decisions were made and what assumptions were in place. It also helps teams learn, because when something goes wrong, you can trace the decision chain and improve it. Beginners sometimes think documentation is just paperwork, but in risk work it is evidence of responsibility and rational decision-making. That is why strong AI governance programs insist that ownership and decision rights are written down and that approvals are recorded. The point is not to create more writing. The point is to prevent confusion and protect the organization's ability to defend itself. To close, defining AI risk ownership clearly is about building a structure where decisions are made deliberately, responsibilities are assigned, and accountability is visible before harm occurs. Roles describe who does the work, accountability describes who is answerable for outcomes, and decision rights describe who is authorized to approve, reject, or require changes. Business owners must accept accountability for AI use cases because they own the outcomes, while technical teams own technical readiness and controls. Risk, compliance, legal, privacy, and security functions provide guardrails, review evidence, and enforce requirements, especially for high-impact uses. Decision points should be identified and assigned so governance is real, not implied, and oversight should scale with impact so the process is both effective and usable. When organizations get ownership right, they move faster and safer at the same time, because clarity reduces both chaos and shadow use. This ownership mindset will support everything we do next, especially when we talk about governance structures, charters, and practical policies that keep AI risk manageable.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.